We're going to start with Dr. Genna Rae McNeil, who's written this book, Groundwork. So let's start, if we can, first, Professor McNeil, if you want to tell us a little bit about who's Charles Hamilton Houston and what we should know about him.
Thank you so much for the invitation. Can you hear me? Okay. If you did not receive 3 handouts, on the back table there's one called The Decline of North Carolina, the other From Moral Mondays to Forward Together, and another, A Working People's Agenda. These are some items that I'd like to share with you. When I returned from the march, there was someone at the airport that had a sign that said, "You're entering North Carolina, surrender your rights." You may have heard what's going on in North Carolina, and I was pleased to have the opportunity to have something to say about Charles Houston and his legacy today, because I think it's very important that we understand the historical context for what is happening all over the country with respect to the reaction to what might be a third Reconstruction, with the emergence of black political figures and black power in this period, and the actions with respect to gerrymandering of legislatures such as Texas and North Carolina. So I'm going to be looking for some questions, but I'm going to integrate biographical information about Charles Houston along with some information about his activities as a lawyer and an activist. As you heard from Professor Ogletree, Charles Hamilton Houston was born in Washington, D.C. in 1895. And he was born to a family of what was be considered privilege. He was able to attend a school that was the only African-American college preparatory school, meaning that not only did they prepare them for college, but they had teachers who, if teaching French, had, for example, studied at the Sorbonne, teachers with PhDs, teachers who were not welcome in some universities but were interested in teaching our high school students so that they might move further in the university systems. He went to Amherst College, where he excelled. He was a Phi Beta Kappa there, and then went back to Howard University to teach for a while. But when World War I had begun, he decided that he would enlist in the officers' camp, and he became first an artillery officer and later an officer with another cadre. However, he was called upon to be the attorney for an African American who was up for court-martial. And when you are asked by the Army to be the attorney for someone who is in the midst of a court-martial, the officers expect you to find that person guilty. And he said that the system itself was so unfair, and the experience of racial discrimination and almost getting lynched in France, Houston and other black officers, that he knew that he was not going to continue in a field that was unrelated to making certain that people had their rights, especially people of color. So he decided to go to Harvard Law School, where he there also excelled. You've heard that he was the first African American on the Law Review. And he went to Spain after that and got a doctorate in juridical science. He traveled a bit on the continent of Africa before returning home, and then both practiced law in his firm with his father, William Houston. His mother was an educated woman who had been a teacher, but was creating the resources for law school and for Charles Houston's other education through being a formal hairdresser for whites and for blacks. The father, however, was the lawyer with whom Charles Houston began to work, and then he went on to become a professor and then eventually a dean at Howard Law School. They call him dean. He was officially a vice dean because they didn't have salary for the dean of the law school at that time. So technically, when you look at the records, you'll see vice dean, but he was the highest ranking academic officer at the law school. At that law school, he was able to transform the law school from a night school into a fully accredited day law school, which met the qualifications for the American Association of Law Schools and the American Bar Association. Built up the library, and they're trained in the first class of the full-time day school. Oliver Hill, a important attorney from Virginia, who not only did education cases but became a major political figure in Richmond, Virginia, and Thurgood Marshall, who was also the classmate of Oliver Hill. The students at that time had a curriculum that was a traditional curriculum in terms of the way in which the classes were listed, but Oliver Hill and Thurgood Marshall told me that within the context of tax law, corporation law, civil procedure, anything like that, the professors would talk about matters that had to do with racial justice, racial equity, discrimination, and so it came to be a school where you knew you would learn something about civil rights. And what Charles Houston aimed to do, and what Howard Law School became, was a school for what Houston called social engineers. His kind of social engineer was a person that was intentionally a trained lawyer, excellent in his or her field, meeting the needs of the community, but also engaged in using the law as a weapon to eliminate racial discrimination. After Charles Houston went to the NAACP to become the first special counsel and developed a plan and strategy for moving from segregated public schools to a decision that would lead to desegregated public schools, Charles Houston's colleague and friend from Washington, D.C., James Nabrett, actually developed the very first civil rights course at Howard Law School. Would you like me to stop there, or you want me to go on with NAACP?
Yeah, one more minute.
You want me to do NAACP?
Yep.
Okay. When we talk about the road to Brown, one thing you were not able to see is that Charles Houston developed the campaign that led to Brown versus Board, not as simply a litigation strategy, but planned litigation as a part of a movement, a social movement. He considered the struggle for racial justice, for freedom and equality, something that was going to be a protracted struggle, and that the root of that struggle had to be tied to the various communities where there were persons suffering from inequities in schools. My colleague from South Carolina and I have shown a film, another part of A Road to Brown, where Charles Houston and colleagues went to the South and actually took pictures of the shacks that were for the schools for African Americans and the beautiful brick buildings that were schools in South Carolina for the white students. Also, you might want to know that teachers, of course, were not paid the same. There was unequal teacher pay. The important thing to know as I close is that we're talking about moving to litigation of a case when African Americans were few in number and unable to elect sufficient persons to change laws in the Congress or in their legislatures. So they used the court as a way to move to change law that would change behavior, even if it didn't change hearts and minds. And Houston understood that law had its limits, and that social movements and protests were absolutely required by the masses, with identification by the masses of the things that they wanted with respect to higher education in order to be successful in the struggle to eliminate segregation from public education. And I'll stop there.
Thank you.